The dust hadn't settled, literally or figuratively. Ethan parked his city car, its sleek lines incongruous against the weathered farmhouse paint. His grandfather was gone, leaving behind acres of whispering corn, a dilapidated house choked with memories, and a grief so heavy it felt like the humid Iowa air. He was here to sort, to sign papers, to sever ties with a life he'd escaped years ago. But the cornfield, rippling like a vast, green ocean under the late summer sun, seemed to remember him, its endless rustling a constant, unsettling welcome home he wasn't ready for. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The gravel crunched under Ethan's worn sneakers, a sound swallowed instantly by the immense quiet of the farmstead. Quiet, except for the corn. It bordered the property on three sides, a towering, emerald barricade already chest high, the stalks thick as wrists. Late August sun beat down, shimmering off the waxy leaves, making the air thick with the scent of damp earth and growing things. It was a smell intrinsically tied to childhood summers, yet now it felt cloying, almost suffocating. He pushed open the creaking screen door of the farmhouse. Inside, time seemed to have coagulated. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing through grimy windows. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, practical and worn. His grandfather's armchair still bore the faint indentation of his form, a ghostly echo that sent a fresh pang of grief through Ethan. He was supposed to be cataloging assets, dealing with lawyers, deciding the fate of this land that felt both intimately familiar and utterly alien. Ethan, a graphic designer living a meticulously curated life in Chicago, felt adrift. His apartment overlooked bustling streets, a landscape of concrete and glass. Here, the only view was the endless, shifting green of the cornfield, its presence inescapable. He remembered hot, sticky summers spent exploring the fringes of these fields, his grandfather's gruff voice echoing warnings, "Don't wander too deep, boy. Easy to get turned around. Field takes what it wants sometimes." Ethan had dismissed it as farmer's superstition, the rambling of a man tethered to the soil in ways Ethan couldn't comprehend. Now, standing in the heavy silence of the house, those words felt less like folklore and more like a premonition. He spent the first day opening windows, letting the breeze stir the stale air, sorting through yellowed bills and farm ledgers. His grandfather, a man of routine and terse affection, lived on in the neat stacks of receipts and the worn tools hanging in the shed. Ethan found old photographs, himself as a gap-toothed kid, squinting in the sun, his grandfather standing stiffly beside a tractor, rarely smiling. In one faded Polaroid, Ethan was perched on the edge of the cornfield, grinning, holding up a half-eaten apple. He remembered that day, the feeling of infinite possibility the field represented, but also a strange, prickling awareness at his back, like unseen eyes watching from between the stalks. Late afternoon found him walking the property line, the sun beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows. The corn rustled incessantly. It wasn't a gentle whisper, it was a dry, papery friction, a million tiny voices murmuring secrets just beyond comprehension. It seemed to follow him, the sound intensifying as he drew near, receding as he moved away. He told himself it was just the wind, the physics of sound across the vast expanse. But the explanation felt thin, inadequate. Near the western edge, half hidden by overgrown weeds, he stumbled upon an old wooden post driven deep into the earth. It might have once held a scarecrow, but now it was just weathered timber, scarred and leaning. Touching the rough wood sparked a flicker of memory, a game, played near this very spot. Hide and seek. He and who? Cousins? Neighbors? He couldn't recall specific faces, just the thrill of hiding, the breathless anticipation of being found, his grandfather's eventual call summoning them back before dusk fully settled. He remembered his grandfather specifically warning against playing alone near the corn. "It ain't right," he'd grumbled, his eyes scanning the rustling rows. "Games need players. More than one." The silence of the farm pressed in, amplifying his grief and loneliness. The task ahead felt monumental, the emptiness left by his grandfather vast and unfillable. Standing there, at the threshold of that immense green labyrinth, an absurd, childish impulse seized him. A desperate need to break the silence, to connect with something, even if it was just an echo of the past. Maybe it was the grief, the disorientation, the feeling of being small and lost in the face of it all. He took a deep breath, the scent of corn heavy in his lungs. He turned towards the dense rows, cupped his hands around his mouth, and called out the old, familiar phrase, his voice sounding thin and strange in the open air. "Ready or not, here I come." The words hung there for a beat, seeming to echo back from the wall of green. Then, acting purely on that bizarre impulse, Ethan ducked between the first few rows of corn. The broad leaves brushed against his face, cool and slightly damp. He pushed in maybe 10 feet, the sounds of the outside world instantly muffled. Here, surrounded by thick stalks, the world shrank to a narrow, green corridor. He sank down, hidden from view, intending only to sit for a moment, to let the wave of memory and grief wash over him in the shadowed seclusion. He closed his eyes, listening to his own breathing, the frantic thumping of his own heart, and the endless, surrounding rustle of the corn. He sat crouched amidst the corn, the earthy smell filling his nostrils, a scent so potent it was almost tactile. The rustling was a constant presence, a sibilant chorus that seemed both random and purposeful. He focused on the rhythm of his own breathing, trying to anchor himself against the tide of sadness threatening to pull him under. The farm, his grandfather, the unresolved guilt he carried about not visiting more often, it all pressed in. Hiding here, like a child, felt strangely appropriate, a regression mirroring his emotional state. Then, something shifted. The wind, which had been sighing through the upper leaves, seemed to die down. Not gradually, but abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. An unnatural stillness fell over the immediate area, the constant rustling around him diminishing to an almost imperceptible whisper. The air grew heavy, expectant. Goosebumps rose on Ethan's arms despite the lingering warmth of the day. And then he heard it. Faint at first, but chillingly distinct. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal scuttling through the undergrowth. It was a sound coming from deeper within the cornfield, somewhere in the dense, shadowed heart of the rows. A dry, rhythmic shuffling, like brittle leaves being carefully, deliberately brushed aside. Accompanying it, weaving through the rustle, was another sound, one that made the blood freeze in his veins. Whispering. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly clear. 1. The word hung in the unnaturally still air, seeming to soak into the very stalks around him. It was a low, dry whisper, sexless, ageless, like the rubbing of husks together given volition. Ethan's breath hitched. His eyes snapped open, scanning the narrow green corridor ahead and behind. Nothing. Just endless rows of corn, leaves casting dappled, shifting shadows. 2. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in his chest. This wasn't his imagination. It wasn't acoustics. The sound was there, methodical, relentless. It was counting. Someone, or something, was counting. As if in response to his foolishly shouted invitation. 3. He scrambled backward, crab walking on trembling hands and feet, heedless of the sharp leaves slicing at his exposed arms. The stalks seemed to grasp at him, the rustling around him intensifying again, but now it felt different, watchful, knowing. He burst out of the first few rows, stumbling into the open space between the field and the farmhouse, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He spun around, staring wildly at the impassive green wall of corn. The rustling continued, seemingly normal now, carried on the restored breeze. The whispering count was gone, vanished as quickly as it had begun. Wind, he gasped aloud, the words sounding unconvincing even to himself. Just the wind. Weird acoustics. Grief messing with my head. He repeated the rationalizations like a mantra, backing away towards the relative safety of the house. He had to be imagining things. Stress, lack of sleep, the emotional turmoil, it was the only logical explanation. Playing hide and seek alone? Shouting into the empty field? It was borderline insane, proof that he wasn't thinking clearly. He slammed the screen door behind him, the familiar squeak and bang momentarily grounding. Inside, he paced the small living room, forcing himself to take deep breaths. He splashed cold water on his face from the kitchen tap, staring at his pale, wide-eyed reflection in the small mirror above the sink. He looked haunted. For the rest of the afternoon, Ethan threw himself into the task of sorting, tackling a dusty closet filled with his grandfather's old farming clothes and forgotten belongings. He tried to focus on the tangible, the mundane, moth-eaten wool sweaters, sturdy work boots caked with decades of soil, a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of his grandmother he'd never met. Anything to distract from the memory of that whispered counting. But it lingered at the edge of his awareness, an icy counterpoint to the warm, familiar scent of cedar and dust. As evening approached, casting long, deep shadows across the yard, Ethan found himself drawn to the windows overlooking the cornfield. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the field itself seemed to absorb the light, growing darker, more monolithic. The rustling continued, a constant, whispering tide. But now, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. There seemed to be a pattern to it, a subtle rhythm that wasn't entirely dictated by the wind's capricious gusts. He stood by the back porch, the screen door separating him from the encroaching dusk. The porch light flickered on, casting a weak yellow puddle onto the overgrown grass. Beyond its reach, the cornfield loomed, a wall of impenetrable shadow. He thought he saw movement, a flicker between the stalks, something tall and unnaturally thin gliding silently deeper into the green abyss. He blinked, strained his eyes. Nothing. Just the play of light and shadow, the swaying of the corn in the evening breeze. He told himself it was nothing. Just shadows. Just the wind. Just his grief-stricken mind playing tricks. But as he locked the doors that night, the memory of the whispered count, 1, 2, 3, echoed in the heavy silence of the old farmhouse, and a chilling certainty began to dawn. He had started a game, and something out there, in the rustling darkness, had heard him. Something had decided to play. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively cheerful. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ethan woke groggily from a restless sleep plagued by vague dreams of running through endless green corridors. He tried to shake off the unease of the previous day, determined to approach his tasks with renewed rationality. It was just a field. Cornfields rustled. Grief made people imagine things. He forced himself through the motions, coffee, stale toast, making a list of things to tackle. He decided to start with the barn, needing physical labor to occupy his mind. But as he stepped out onto the back porch, the feeling hit him instantly, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the distinct, unnerving certainty of being watched. He scanned the edge of the cornfield, its green expanse stretching away under the morning sun. Nothing seemed out of place. The stalks swayed gently, the rustling a familiar, innocuous sound. Yet, the feeling persisted, intense and focused. Then he saw it. Sitting squarely in the center of the worn wooden doormat, where nothing had been just moments before, was a single corncob. It wasn't old or discarded, it was plump, perfectly formed, its kernels a uniform, pale yellow, still encased in tight green husks, a strand of golden silk trailing from the top. It looked deliberately placed, an offering or a token. A chilling realization washed over Ethan. This wasn't random. This was a response. A move in a game he hadn't consciously agreed to play. He stared at the corncob, his rationalizations crumbling. Wind couldn't place something so precisely. An animal wouldn't leave such a perfect specimen. He backed away slowly, not wanting to touch it, feeling a profound sense of trespass. He quickly went back inside, locking the door behind him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Throughout the morning, as he tried to work in the barn, sorting through rusted tools and old machinery, the feeling of being observed was relentless. Every time he moved near the wide barn doors that faced the field, he felt the unseen gaze intensify. The rustling seemed to follow him, a subtle shift in the sound that seemed to track his movements along the field's edge. He'd stop, and the specific patch of corn nearest him would seem to rustle louder for a moment before falling back into the general chorus. He'd move 50 feet down, and the phenomenon would repeat. Coincidence? Paranoia? Or was something actively tracking him from within the green maze? He started hearing the counting again, intermittently. Not loud, just faint whispers carried on the breeze, seeming to drift from the depths of the field. 4. He thought he heard while wrestling with a stubborn piece of equipment. Later, while pausing for water near the house, a distinct 5. Seemed to curl around the corner of the building, impossibly close. Each time, it felt slightly nearer, the intervals between counts shortening almost imperceptibly. It was as if an invisible clock was ticking, marking the progress of a relentless seeker. There were also moments of profound, localized silence. He'd be walking near the field, the air filled with the drone of insects and the constant rustle, and suddenly, a pocket of absolute stillness would envelop him. The rustling would cease in his immediate vicinity, the insect sounds would die away, the world holding its breath for a few stretched seconds. In those moments, the feeling of being listened to, of being intensely scrutinized by something just beyond the veil of the visible, was overwhelming. Then, just as abruptly, the sounds would rush back in, leaving him shaken and disoriented. Desperate for a connection to the outside world, to normalcy, Ethan retreated to the house and picked up the old landline phone in the hallway. He needed to hear a friendly voice, to talk about anything other than corn and whispered counting. He dialed his friend Maya back in Chicago. The line clicked, hissed, and then filled with a strange, pervasive static. It wasn't the usual fuzz of a bad connection. It was a dry, shuffling sound, punctuated by tiny clicks and pops. With a sickening lurch in his stomach, Ethan realized what it sounded like. Corn rustling. Hello? Maya's voice finally came through, distant and distorted, struggling against the wall of sound. Ethan? Is that you? What's all that noise? Maya? Can you hear me? Ethan shouted into the receiver, gripping it tightly. Listen, something weird is happening here. What? I can barely hear you. It sounds like you're standing in a hurricane of paper bags. He tried to explain, the game, the counting, the corncob, the feeling of being watched. But the words came out jumbled, panicked. The rustling static on the line seemed to mock his attempts, twisting his fear into the ravings of a paranoid lunatic. Even to his own ears, it sounded insane. Counting in the cornfield. Static crackled like dry leaves, think it's playing hide and seek. The line hissed and popped, grandfather warned me. Ethan, are you okay? Maya's voice was laced with concern, but also confusion. Maybe you should. I don't know, get some rest? It sounds really stressful out there. The line crackled violently, the rustling sound surging, almost drowning her out. Then, with a final click, the connection died. Dead air. He slammed the receiver down, frustration and fear warring within him. He was cut off. Isolated. The field, the entity within it, wasn't just playing a game, it was actively ensuring he played it alone. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had initiated the game by calling out, by hiding. And something ancient, something tied to this land, had accepted the invitation. The rules were unseen, the opponent invisible, but the game was undeniably, terrifyingly on. And it was starting to feel less like a game and more like a hunt. The following day brought a new kind of dread. The subtle signs and whispered counts coalesced into a palpable pressure, an invisible weight pressing down on Ethan. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore, it was a growing, internal compulsion, a perverse sense of obligation. The game had rules, even if he didn't understand them, and a deep, irrational part of him felt an overwhelming urge to play fair. He found himself glancing constantly towards the cornfield, his anxiety mounting with every rustle. The intermittent counting continued, seeming to follow a slow, inexorable rhythm. 6, whispered on the wind as he tried to fix a leaking faucet. 7, murmured from the direction of the field as he forced down lunch. It felt like a countdown, a timer ticking towards some unseen event. He fought the urge, the irrational pull to go back to the edge, to find a hiding spot before the count reached its conclusion. He knew it was madness, yet the psychological pressure was immense, a constant hum beneath his conscious thoughts, like the field itself was exerting its will upon him. He tried locking himself in the house, drawing the curtains, attempting to create a barrier against the pervasive influence. But the rustling seemed to seep through the walls, the feeling of being sought intensified by confinement. He found himself pacing, agitated, drawn repeatedly to the windows overlooking the green expanse. It was like a magnetic pull, the rustling whispers seeming to beckon him, promising. What? Resolution? Escape? Or simply the next stage of the terrifying game? Mid-afternoon, unable to bear the pressure any longer, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the cornfield again. He wasn't consciously deciding to go, his feet simply carried him there while his mind raced with denial and fear. This is crazy, he muttered, heart pounding. I'm just going to look. Prove there's nothing there. He peered into the narrow opening between two towering rows. The air inside looked cooler, darker. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of leaves, creating a disorienting pattern of light and shadow. Hesitantly, he took a step inside, then another. The rustling instantly enveloped him, louder here, more intimate. The smell of damp earth and pollen was strong. He scanned the rows ahead, listening intently. No counting, just the omnipresent whisper of the stalks. He took a few more steps, pushing deeper than before, trying to pierce the green gloom. He wasn't hiding this time, he told himself, he was investigating. Trying to find the source, to debunk his own fear. That's when he saw it. Not a figure, not anything distinct. Far down the row, maybe 50 yards deep, a section of corn stalks parted unnaturally, as if something large had just pushed through. They swayed back into place, but the movement was too deliberate, too localized to be the wind. He froze, straining his eyes. A moment later, in an adjacent row, he saw another flicker of movement, a violent rustling confined to a small patch, lasting only a second before falling still. Then, further off, glimpsed through a gap in the leaves, a shadow detached itself from the base of the stalks. It seemed impossibly tall and thin, elongated and distorted by the filtered light, and it slid silently between the rows, disappearing deeper into the field's heart. Ethan stumbled back, heart leaping into his throat. He hadn't seen what it was, but he had seen something. Something moving with unnatural stealth and purpose. He scrambled out of the corn, breathing heavily, the image of the too tall shadow burned into his mind. He was leaning against the weathered siding of the farmhouse, trying to regain his composure, when the crunch of tires on gravel announced an arrival. A mud-splattered sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Brody climbed out, a man whose face seemed as weathered as the landscape, his eyes holding a mixture of small-town weariness and shrewd observation. He adjusted his hat, his gaze taking in Ethan's pale face and the slight tremor in his hands. "Ethan, right? Heard you were back," Brody said, his voice calm and even. He offered condolences for Ethan's grandfather, the words practiced but seemingly sincere. "Just checking in. See how you're settling in, if you need anything." Ethan hesitated. How much could he say without sounding completely unhinged? "It's quiet out here," he managed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Taking some getting used to." Brody nodded slowly, his eyes drifting towards the towering wall of corn. "It's that time of year. Gets thick. Heard my share of stories about folks getting turned around in these fields. Go in for a minute, come out hours later, swearin' the rows shifted on M." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Old man Henderson, your grandpa, he knew this land. Respected it." Ethan seized the opening, cautiously. "Did he ever mention anything strange? About the cornfield? Legends, maybe?" Brody chewed on his lower lip, his gaze lingering on the corn. "Well," he said slowly, "always been talk. Superstitions. Folks round here say you don't mess with the corn after dusk. Say you don't go wanderin' in there alone, especially not. Well, not if you're feelin' playful." He glanced sharply at Ethan. "Just farmer talk, most likely. Land gets in your head out here if you let it." He didn't elaborate, but the way he said playful, the subtle emphasis, sent a fresh chill down Ethan's spine. Brody knew more than he was letting on. He might dismiss it as folklore, but the sheriff was aware of the old whispers, the warnings passed down through generations. "Anything else I can do for you, son?" Brody asked, his hand resting on the door of his cruiser. No, Sheriff. Thanks for stopping by," Ethan mumbled. Brody gave a curt nod. "You take care now. Holler if you need anything." He drove off, leaving Ethan alone once more with the house, the grief, and the immense, watchful presence of the cornfield. The brief intrusion of the outside world, of authority, had done little to dispel the growing horror. If anything, Brody's veiled warnings had only confirmed it. He wasn't just losing his mind. Something ancient and territorial resided in those rustling rows, and it was patiently, terrifyingly, waiting for him to hide again. The brief encounter with Sheriff Brody solidified Ethan's fear but offered no solution. The isolation felt heavier now, the cornfield's presence more dominant. Its influence began to bleed beyond the property line, seeping into the house, into Ethan's very perception. He started smelling it indoors, even with the windows shut tight against the evening chill. The phantom scent of damp earth, crushed green leaves, and the sweet, cloying smell of corn silk would drift through the rooms, thick and persistent. At night, lying rigid in his grandfather's old bed, the creaks and groans of the aging house seemed to take on a different quality. The settling timbers sounded like stalks rubbing together, the wind sighing under the eaves like whispers just beyond the range of hearing. A creeping claustrophobia set in. Even in the relatively spacious farmhouse rooms, Ethan felt hemmed in, constricted. The walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower. Looking out the window at the dense rows of corn felt like staring at the bars of a cage. His dreams became oppressive, vivid nightmares. He wasn't just running through green corridors anymore, he was sinking, buried alive under shifting mounds of dry kernels, suffocating on golden silk, the sound of rhythmic counting a deafening roar as unseen hands pulled him down into the earth. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the phantom smell of corn thick in his nostrils. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. Driven by a desperate need for answers, for anything that might explain the escalating terror, Ethan turned his attention to his grandfather's workshop, a small, cluttered space off the kitchen that smelled of sawdust, oil, and old secrets. His grandfather hadn't been a man for idle talk, but he'd been meticulous in his record-keeping. Ethan sifted through boxes of receipts, equipment manuals, and seed catalogs, hoping for some clue, some mention of the field's peculiarity. Finally, tucked away on a high shelf, covered in dust, he found them, several worn, leather-bound ledgers. They started like typical farm journals, detailed notes on crop rotations, fertilizer schedules, rainfall measurements, market prices. But interspersed with the mundane agricultural data were other entries, penned in his grandfather's cramped, spidery handwriting. These were different. Cryptic, almost fearful. October 12, 1987, field restless tonight. Left the usual share near the old post. Must keep the rows quiet. September 3, 1995, dry year. Harvest might be lean. Hope the field's due is enough. Can't afford trouble. August 28, 2003, heard something. Counting? Wind playing tricks. Told the boy, Ethan? Stay clear. Doesn't understand. July 16, 2010. Found tracks again. Too deep for deer. Straight towards the house. Appeasement seems to be holding. For now. September 30, 2018. Harvest moon. Never disturb it under the full harvest moon. Especially not alone. Remembers old debts. Demands attention. Warning, never treat it like a game. Never invite it lightly. It listens. It waits. It plays by its own rules. Ethan read the entries again and again, a cold dread settling deep in his bones. His grandfather hadn't just been superstitious, he'd been actively managing something. Appeasements. The fields do. Keeping the rows quiet. It was clear his grandfather knew about the entity, this sentient presence tied to the corn. He hadn't just warned Ethan away out of vague caution, he'd known the specific dangers, the potential consequences of disrespect or foolish invitations. The game Ethan had impulsively started wasn't just a game to whatever resided in the corn, it was a serious transgression, a summoning. The physical toll of the constant fear and lack of sleep was becoming apparent. Dark circles shadowed Ethan's eyes. His hands trembled slightly. He moved with a jerky, anxious energy. He started finding thin, stinging scratches on his arms and legs in the mornings, scratches he had no memory of getting. They looked exactly like the shallow cuts one might get from brushing against sharp corn leaves, but they appeared overnight, while he was supposedly safe inside the locked house. It was as if the field could reach him even here, leaving its mark, reminding him of its inescapable presence. He felt trapped, not just physically on the isolated farm, but psychologically, caught in a web woven by his own grief-stricken impulse and his grandfather's hidden knowledge. The field wasn't just land, it was a power, ancient and demanding, and he had unwittingly provoked it. The cryptic warnings in the journal offered no easy solutions, only a chilling confirmation of the danger he was in. The game was real, the stakes were terrifyingly high, and the field's influence was tightening around him like the relentless growth of the corn itself. The entity in the cornfield, the seeker, grew bolder. The subtle hints and fleeting glimpses gave way to more overt signs of its relentless pursuit, its presence pressing closer, becoming almost territorial. One morning, Ethan found a distinct path trampled through the tall grass leading from the edge of the cornfield directly towards the back porch. The grass was flattened, the earth disturbed, as if something large and heavy had repeatedly walked that route during the night. There were no discernible footprints, just the undeniable evidence of passage. It was a clear message, I know where you are. I am coming closer. The counting became more persistent, no longer just carried on the wind from the depths of the field. One night, jolted awake by a nightmare, Ethan lay frozen in the darkness, listening. And he heard it, the slow, whispered count, 8, 9, seeming to come from right outside his bedroom window. He didn't dare look. The feeling of being hunted was no longer intermittent, it was a constant, suffocating pressure, the certainty that unseen eyes were always watching, waiting, patiently stalking him according to the rules of its horrifying game. He realized with dawning terror that the seeker wasn't just playing, it felt like it was claiming. His impulsive invitation hadn't just started a game, it had drawn the entity's focus, anchoring its attention to him, to the house. Fueled by the disturbing entries in his grandfather's journals and a rising tide of desperation, Ethan knew he needed more information. Rationalization was impossible now, survival depended on understanding the threat. He drove into the small nearby town, the change of scenery doing little to ease his anxiety. The vast fields lining the highway seemed to watch him pass. He considered going back to Sheriff Brody, but the memory of the sheriff's dismissive yet knowing tone made him hesitate. Brody knew of the legends, but would he truly help, or just offer more folksy warnings? Instead, Ethan found the town's tiny, dusty library, hoping to find local history books or archives that might mention old folklore or strange occurrences related to the surrounding farmlands. The librarian, a kind-faced elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, seemed to recognize his grandfather's name. Ah, yes, Arthur Henderson's grandson, she said, peering over her spectacles. Hard worker, your grandfather. Kept to himself mostly, but always respected the land. Ethan steered the conversation carefully. I've been reading some of his old journals, he said, trying to sound casual. He mentioned old stories. About the fields. Particularly the corn. Mrs. Gable's smile tightened slightly. Oh, there are always stories, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Every rural place has them. Especially around land that's been farmed for generations. She leaned closer. They say some fields. Remember. They say the corn, it gets possessive. Demands respect. My own grandmother used to say you never play games alone near the deep rows, never mock the harvest. Ethan pressed gently. What kind of respect? What happens if you don't? Well, Mrs. Gable hesitated, glancing around the empty library. Old tales talk about acknowledgement. Leaving a portion of the first fruits, the best of the harvest, out for the field. Appeasement, they called it. Some darker stories hint at more. Significant sacrifices, way back when. Trespassing, showing disrespect, inviting it in frivolously, like treating it as a child's game when you're alone, that angers it. Rouses it. And what happens then? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. What happens if it finds you? Mrs. Gable looked uneasy. People have gotten lost, she said evasively. Vanished. Sometimes they turn up weeks later, miles away, with no memory. Sometimes they don't turn up at all. She paused, her gaze distant. They say being found by the field means being taken by it. Either your body vanishes into the rows, becomes part of the soil, or your mind gets harvested. You become another whisper on the wind, another rustle in the stalks. The librarian's words, echoing the cryptic warnings in his grandfather's journal, painted a terrifying picture. This wasn't just a ghost or a localized haunting. It was something elemental, ancient, woven into the fabric of the land itself. A consciousness within the corn, demanding acknowledgement, punishing transgression. Ethan felt a cold clarity descend upon him. He finally understood the terrible rules of the game he had started. His initial call, ready or not, here I come, wasn't just a phrase, it was an invocation. Hiding, as he had done, provided temporary safety, adhering to the game's structure as the seeker perceived it. But hiding was only one part of the cycle. The counting was the seeker's phase, its patient search. What happened when the count ended? What did being found truly entail? He realized his grandfather's appeasements weren't just symbolic, they were a necessary ritual to keep the entity dormant, satisfied. By playing the game alone, Ethan had bypassed the established truce, directly engaging the entity in a way his grandfather had likely spent years carefully avoiding. Breaking the rules now, trying to flee the play area, the farm, the county? Before the game reached its conclusion, felt incredibly risky. It might be the only way out, but it could also provoke a direct, aggressive, and potentially fatal response from the territorial seeker. He was trapped, bound by the rules of an ancient, terrifying game he never should have started. The whispers seemed louder now, the counting closer. Time was running out. The pressure reached an unbearable crescendo. The air itself felt thick, charged with imminent energy. The sun beat down, but a strange chill permeated the farmstead. The cornfield was a wall of furious motion, the rustling no longer a whisper but a roar, a cacophony of dry friction that scraped at Ethan's nerves. The counting was relentless now, loud, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. 97. 98. It wasn't just a whisper on the wind, it echoed inside the house, vibrated through the floorboards, pulsed in Ethan's own skull. He felt cornered, besieged. The psychological weight was crushing, pushing him, compelling him. He found himself outside again, near the edge of the corn. He didn't remember walking there, but his feet were planted on the dusty earth, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the churning green expanse. Had he been drawn there? Had he succumbed to the need to play fair, to hide before the final count? Or had the entity's influence simply overwhelmed his resistance? It didn't matter now. He was here. 99. The sound was deafening, seeming to emanate from every stalk simultaneously. Panic seized him. He had to hide. Now. He plunged into the nearest row, pushing frantically through the thick stalks, the broad leaves whipping at his face and arms. He ran deeper, stumbling blindly, the roar of the rustling engulfing him. He needed cover, needed to disappear before the final number was called. He found a slightly wider space between two rows, where the stalks grew less densely, and threw himself down, pressing his body flat against the cool earth, pulling loose leaves and dirt over himself. He held his breath, heart hammering against the ground, listening to the maelstrom around him. Then, the final words, spoken not as a whisper, but as a vast, collective sigh that seemed to shake the very air, rolling through the entire field like thunder. 100. Ready or not, here I come. Silence. An absolute, terrifying silence descended. The deafening rustle ceased instantly. The wind died. Not even an insect chirped. It was the profound stillness he'd experienced before, but magnified, intensified, covering the entire field. It was the silence of the hunter focusing, listening, knowing. Ethan lay paralyzed, every muscle screaming for him to run, yet frozen by a primal fear. He could feel it. Not see it, not hear it, but feel it, an immense pressure building, a focused intent sweeping through the rows, searching. He could sense it moving, a vortex of silent energy parting the stalks, methodically checking each corridor, drawing nearer. His mind raced, flashing through the options, the fragments of knowledge gleaned from his grandfather's journal and Mrs. Gable's warnings. Stay hidden? Wait to be found? Face whatever harvesting meant, vanishing physically, or having his sanity stripped away, becoming another whisper in the corn? The thought was paralyzing. Run? Make a blind, desperate dash back towards the house, back towards the edge of the field? Risk breaking the rules of the game, provoking a direct, potentially more violent confrontation? Risk getting hopelessly lost in the disorienting maze as the seeker pursued him? Counteraction? His grandfather's journal mentioned appeasements, the field's due, the old post. Was there something specific he could do? An offering? A ritual? He remembered the post near the western edge where he'd first felt the memory of the game. Did he need to reach it? Leave something there? The journal mentioned iron sometimes being used in folklore to ward off spirits. He had the old tire iron from his car's trunk. But would that provoke or protect? The feeling of the seeker was closer now. He could feel the pressure intensifying just rows away, the silent scrutiny sweeping past his hiding spot. He could almost smell the dry, dusty scent of it, like disturbed earth and ancient husks. It paused. Had it sensed him? His choice had to be made now. With a surge of adrenaline fueled by sheer terror, Ethan decided. Running felt like suicide, hiding felt like surrender. The appeasement, the ritual, felt like the only path, however slim, that acknowledged the entity's power while potentially satisfying its rules, the way his grandfather had. He needed to reach the old post. He burst from his hiding spot, scrambling to his feet and charging down the row, heading west, towards the edge of the field where he remembered the marker. Behind him, the silence shattered. A roar went up from the corn, a sound of fury and pursuit. The wind kicked up violently within the rows, whipping stalks into a frenzy, creating a disorienting vortex of green and shadow. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, the neat rows blurring, twisting. He pushed forward, branches tearing at his clothes, sharp leaves slicing his skin. He could hear it behind him, not footsteps, but a rapid, heavy thrashing, the sound of something immense moving through the corn with impossible speed. Illusory figures flickered at the edge of his vision, his grandfather's stern face, distorted and angry, looming between the stalks, shadowy forms reaching for him. The whispered count returned, no longer numbers, but a sibilant, accusing roar that hammered at his sanity. He could see the edge of the field now, the sunlight beyond the green prison. The old post was just visible, leaning precariously. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out the only thing he had, the tarnished silver locket containing the picture of his grandmother, found in his grandfather's closet. An offering? A connection to the past? It was all he could think of. He burst out of the corn, gasping, and lunged towards the post, shoving the locket deep into the soft earth at its base. As his fingers touched the soil, the roar behind him reached a fever pitch, the wind whipping the corn into a solid wall of green. He felt an immense, invisible force slam into his back, throwing him forward onto the open ground beyond the field's boundary. Ethan lay sprawled on the rough grass bordering the field, gasping for breath, the imprint of the impact still radiating through his body. He didn't dare look back immediately. The roaring wind, the violent thrashing, the deafening rustle, it all abruptly ceased. An unnerving silence fell, heavier and more profound than any before. It wasn't the expectant silence of the hunter, it was the flat, empty silence of withdrawal. Trembling uncontrollably, Ethan slowly pushed himself up. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The cornfield stood impassive, green and vast under the afternoon sun. The stalks swayed gently in the natural breeze, their rustling now just a soft, indifferent whisper. The oppressive presence, the feeling of being hunted, was gone. Utterly gone. The air felt lighter, breathable again. He looked down at the old wooden post. The silver locket was gone, seemingly swallowed by the earth. Had it worked? Was the appeasement accepted? Had leaving the play area while offering something personal, something tied to the family and the land, satisfied the ancient rules or merely broken the cycle? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the stinging cuts on his arms and face, the mud caked on his clothes. He didn't look back at the cornfield again. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. Now. He ran to the farmhouse, his movements jerky and panicked. He didn't pack. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his phone, stumbling back out into the yard. He threw himself into his car, the sleek, modern interior feeling like an alien spacecraft. He jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life, a jarring sound in the sudden quiet. He didn't spare the house or the barn a final glance. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and sped down the long driveway, away from the whispering fields, away from the weight of his grandfather's secrets and the terror he had awakened. He drove for hours, pushing the speed limit, needing distance, needing concrete and streetlights and the noise of civilization to drown out the memory of the rustling and the counting. He sold the farm quickly, remotely, accepting a lowball offer without negotiation. He never wanted to set foot on that land again. He told his friends he couldn't handle the isolation, that the memories were too painful. He never spoke of the hide-and-seek game, the whispered count, the entity in the corn. Who would believe him? He sounded unhinged even to himself when he replayed the events in his mind. But the experience left its mark. He developed a lingering claustrophobia, an aversion to quiet places. He avoided parks with tall grass, couldn't stand the sound of wind chimes that mimicked faint whispers. And sometimes, late at night, when the city noise died down, he thought he could hear it, a faint, dry rustling, like distant corn leaves rubbing together. He lived with the constant, low-level fear that the game wasn't truly over, that the seeker was patient, that perhaps the field's boundary wasn't as absolute as he prayed it was. He was free, but he would forever be looking over his shoulder, haunted by the silence that followed the roar. The appeasement had bought his escape, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was now bound by the same respect, the same fear, that had governed his grandfather's life. The field had taken its due, one way or another. The silence it left behind was not peaceful, it was heavy, watchful, and patiently waiting. Alternative ending, Variant 3, found. He could feel the seeker closing in, the pressure immense, the silent scrutiny just feet away. Paralyzed by terror, Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, pressing himself flatter against the earth, willing himself invisible. Hide. Just hide. It was the only rule he understood, the only action his fear allowed. The pressure intensified, directly above him now. A million dry whispers seemed to converge, swirling around him like dust devils made of sound and intent. He felt a phantom touch, colder than ice, brush against his cheek. The world dissolved into a roaring vortex of rustling green and suffocating earth. Silence. A week later, Sheriff Brody's cruiser crunched up the gravel driveway again. Ethan hadn't answered his phone in days, and Maya, his friend from Chicago, had finally called the county sheriff's office, frantic with worry. The farmhouse stood quiet, undisturbed. The back door was unlocked. Inside, everything seemed mostly in order, though covered in a fresh layer of dust. A half-eaten meal sat on the kitchen table, flies buzzing around it. Ethan's car was still parked near the barn. His wallet and keys were on the hallway table. His phone, however, was missing. Brody walked the property line, his experienced eyes scanning the ground. He saw the faint signs of struggle near the western edge of the cornfield, the disturbed earth around the old scarecrow post. He sighed, adjusting his hat, his gaze sweeping over the vast, impassive expanse of mature corn. It rustled gently in the late summer breeze, whispering its endless secrets. He organized a search party. Volunteers and deputies walked the rows, calling Ethan's name. They combed the dense field for 2 days. Near the center, deep within the disorienting green maze, a deputy found Ethan's phone lying face down on the dirt, its screen cracked, battery dead. There was no other sign of him. No tracks leading away, no blood, nothing. Just the phone, dropped amidst the endless stalks. The official search was eventually called off. Ethan Henderson was listed as a missing person, another unfortunate soul who perhaps got turned around and succumbed to the elements, or maybe just walked away from a life he couldn't handle. Sheriff Brody stood alone at the edge of the cornfield as the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple. He looked grimly at the towering wall of green, the rustling seeming to deepen in the fading light. He remembered Old Man Henderson's warnings, the local legends Mrs. Gable sometimes recounted, the hushed stories of others who had vanished near these fields over the decades. He spat onto the dusty ground. Another one. Another soul found by the field. He turned to leave, the silence pressing in behind him. But as he walked towards his cruiser, a faint sound drifted out from the depths of the cornfield, carried on the evening breeze. It was barely audible, dry and rhythmic, like husks rubbing together. 1. Brody paused, listening, then shook his head and climbed into his car, driving away quickly. Deep within the heart of the cornfield, hidden from the world, the whispering count continued, patient and eternal, waiting for the next game to begin. Fade to black. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.